Richard Hamilton sat on the edge of his leather sofa, staring at the polished marble floor. Everything around him was perfect, expensive. A grand piano sat in the corner of the room, untouched. His gaze shifted to the massive windows, where the curtains swayed slightly, though there was no one around to feel the breeze. The room was quiet, almost sterile. He took a sip from his glass of scotch, the ice rattling lightly. The liquid burned his throat, but it was something to distract from the emptiness. Richard turned his head towards the tall mirror on the wall and stared at his own reflection. Perfectly groomed hair, sharp jawline, expensive suit. His eyes were tired. They didn't belong in that perfect frame. The phone buzzed on the table. It was his assistant. A reminder about tomorrow's meetings. Another full day. Another chance to add another million to his accounts. Richard sighed, tapping the phone to silence. He looked at his watch. It was late. He had a meeting early in the morning. Still, he lingered. He never looked forward to sleep. The house was too silent at night. He got up and walked across the room, his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. He stopped by his desk, noticing a stack of unopened mail. A thick envelope caught his attention. He picked it up. No sender. He hesitated, then dropped it back on the desk, pushing it away. It wasn't worth his time. Richard adjusted his tie, even though it wasn't out of place. He moved through the hallway towards his bedroom. The house was enormous, and every room he passed felt colder and emptier. He stopped at a family portrait. It was old, his ex-wife, their son. His expression darkened, and he quickly turned away. Morning came, and Richard entered his office downtown. The view from the top floor was impressive, but he barely noticed it. His secretary, Helen, greeted him, handing him a coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Hamilton." He nodded, barely making eye contact. "Morning, Helen. What's first?" "A meeting with the board at 9. The new competitor, Daniel Investments, has been gaining ground. They're pushing for market share aggressively." Richard frowned. "Daniel Investments?" He took the coffee and walked into his office, shutting the door behind him. He didn't like surprises. A new name in the market wasn't just a competitor. It was a threat. He opened his laptop, checking the numbers Helen had mentioned. Daniel Investments was indeed expanding. They had gained significant traction in just a few months. It wasn't normal. Richard's grip tightened around his coffee cup. He didn't like things that weren't under his control. Later that day, Richard sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by his board members. They were discussing strategy, numbers, projections. He listened, but his thoughts drifted. His eyes narrowed as they spoke about Daniel Investment. "Who runs this company?" Richard asked, interrupting the presentation. One of the directors flipped through his notes. A young guy, Daniel Marks, very ambitious. He's come out of nowhere, but he's made some big moves." "Ambitious and reckless," Richard muttered, a hint of irritation in his voice. "We'll see how long he lasts." He leaned back in his chair, but there was something about that name, something familiar that nagged at him. He pushed it aside. The meeting ended, and the directors left the room. Richard lingered, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. He couldn't shake off the feeling that this Daniel had a personal vendetta against him. He needed more information, and quickly. Later that night, Richard found himself at home again. The massive front door closed behind him, and the silence enveloped him like a cold blanket. He stepped into his study, his eyes catching the unopened envelope still sitting on his desk. His jaw tightened. He reached for it but hesitated again. Something about it made his chest feel heavy. Richard dropped the envelope back on the desk, a slight sense of unease settling in. He looked around the room, feeling the emptiness more intensely tonight. The grand piano, the antique bookshelves, the priceless paintings, none of it mattered. It was all decoration, the kind that could be bought. He poured another glass of scotch and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights sparkled. He wondered, briefly, if Daniel Marks was out there somewhere, celebrating his rise. He took a long drink, the alcohol numbing his thoughts. Maybe it was time to pay more attention. A sudden memory flashed in his mind. The image of a young boy standing by the roadside, tears streaming down his face. Richard shut his eyes, trying to push the memory away. It was from a long time ago, a mistake he didn't want to think about. He turned away from the window, deciding it was best to get some sleep. The next morning, Richard walked into his office with a renewed sense of urgency. "Helen," he called, without pausing, "get me everything on Daniel Marks. I want a complete background check. Family, history, everything." Helen looked slightly taken aback but nodded. Right away, Mr. Hamilton. Richard entered his office, closing the door with a firm click. He knew that if Daniel Marks was going to be a problem, it was best to get ahead of it now. He opened his laptop and started looking at market reports, trying to find a weakness. The numbers were impressive. Daniel had made significant progress in a short amount of time. It wasn't just luck. This was calculated. Helen entered the office with a folder. "Here's what we have on Daniel Marks so far," she said, setting it on his desk. Richard opened the folder, scanning the contents. A photo of a young man stared back at him. There was something in the eyes, something that made Richard's stomach drop. He didn't know why, but he felt a connection, an unsettling sense of familiarity. He closed the folder, pushing it away. He needed more. He needed to talk to this Daniel. "Helen, arrange a meeting with him. I want to know what his intentions are," Richard said, his tone colder than usual. Helen hesitated. "I'll see what I can do, Mr. Hamilton." Richard nodded, staring at the folder. There was more to this than just a business rivalry. He felt it deep inside, even if he didn't want to admit it. He clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger. Anger at being challenged, and anger at the memories that wouldn't leave him alone. That night, Richard sat alone in his study again. The envelope was still there, taunting him. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, then tossed it back on the desk. He poured himself another drink, his hands trembling slightly. The past was better left buried, but somehow, it kept finding its way back to him. He needed to deal with Daniel Marks, and he needed to do it soon. The next morning, Richard walked into his office with a sense of determination. Today, he was going to learn everything there was to know about Daniel Marks. Helen had arranged the meeting as requested, and the young entrepreneur had accepted. Richard found himself preparing for a conversation that he wasn't entirely ready for, but he knew he couldn't back down. This was about his reputation, his empire, and something else, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite put into words. "Mr. Hamilton, he's here." Helen's voice came over the intercom. "Shall I bring him in?" Richard adjusted his tie, his jaw set. "Yes, send him in." The door opened, and Daniel Marks walked in. He was younger than Richard expected, early 30s, maybe. He wore a simple suit, but his posture radiated confidence. Richard watched him closely, noting the way Daniel's eyes scanned the room, almost as if evaluating the man sitting behind the massive oak desk. "Mr. Hamilton," Daniel said, his voice even, almost casual. He didn't sound intimidated, which bothered Richard more than he cared to admit. "Mr. Marks," Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Daniel sat down, crossing his legs. There was a moment of silence before Richard spoke, his voice measured. "I've been hearing quite a bit about your company lately. You seem to be expanding rather aggressively." Daniel's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "That's the idea. There's opportunity out there, and I'm not one to let it slip by." Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. "And why my company? Why compete directly with Hamilton Investments?" Daniel didn't flinch. He met Richard's gaze with a cool, almost detached look. "Why not? You're at the top, Mr. Hamilton. Everyone's aiming for the top. Besides, it's nothing personal." Richard studied the young man's face, searching for a flicker of emotion, something to give away his real motive. But Daniel remained unreadable, his expression calm. It was almost infuriating. "Nothing personal," Richard repeated, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You expect me to believe that?" Daniel shrugged, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Believe what you want, Mr. Hamilton, but I'm here to do business just like you." Richard's jaw tightened. He wanted to press further, but something held him back. There was something in Daniel's demeanor that made him pause, a familiarity, something in his eyes that reminded Richard of a memory he was desperately trying to ignore. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm, but with a hint of steel beneath it. "I didn't come here to ask for your permission, Mr. Hamilton. I'm here to compete, and I will compete. If that bothers you, then maybe you're not as secure as you thought you were." Richard's eyes hardened. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. "Listen, Marks, I've been in this business for longer than you've been out of school. I don't take kindly to threats, and I don't like people stepping on my toes." Daniel smiled, a small, cold smile. "It's not a threat, Mr. Hamilton. It's a promise." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "If you want to hold on to what you have, you'd better be prepared to fight for it." Richard stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake, Marks." Daniel paused by the door, turning back. For the first time, there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of emotion, something that Richard couldn't quite identify. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just setting things right." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Richard sat in silence for a moment, his hands still flat on the desk. He felt a rush of anger, but beneath it, there was something else, a sense of dread. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let the feeling take hold. That evening, Richard sat in his study. The lights dimmed. The envelope was still there, untouched. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. He knew he should open it, but a part of him resisted. He set it down again, rubbing his temples. The conversation with Daniel replayed in his mind, his words echoing, "Maybe I'm just setting things right." What did that mean? Richard's thoughts drifted to the past, to a time he rarely allowed himself to think about. The roadside, the crying boy, the decision he made that day. He shook his head, trying to push the memory away, but it lingered, stubborn and insistent. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Richard reached for it, grateful for the distraction. "Yes, Mr. Hamilton, it's Helen." His assistant's voice came through, slightly hesitant. "There's something you should see. A report just came through. It's about Daniel Marks." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He sat up straighter. "What is it?" He's been buying shares in Hamilton Investment. Small amounts, but consistent. He's gaining a foothold." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "How much does he own?" "Not enough to pose a direct threat, but it's significant enough to be worrying." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Daniel wasn't just competing. He was infiltrating. Richard hung up without another word, the sense of dread returning. He looked at the envelope again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He ripped it open, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the letter. The words on the page were simple, but they hit him like a punch to the gut. "I know what you did. I'm coming for you." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He dropped the letter, staring at it as if it had burned him. He knew, deep down, what this was about. He knew who had sent it, even without a name. It was his past, coming back to haunt him. He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. This wasn't just business, this was personal. Daniel Marks wasn't just a competitor, he was something much worse. Richard felt the walls of his study closing in, the silence of the house suddenly oppressive. He needed to act. He needed to protect everything he had built. But most of all, he needed to face the truth he had buried for so many years, the truth that was now standing right in front of him, demanding to be reckoned with. The next morning, Richard walked into the office, his face set in a mask of determination. He called Helen into his office. "I want every detail on Daniel Marks, family, connections, anything we can use." Helen nodded, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. "Mr. Hamilton, are you sure this is the best approach? It seems personal." Richard's eyes flashed with anger. "It is personal, Helen, and I need to end this before it goes any further." Helen nodded, stepping out of the office. Richard sat down, his hands resting on the desk. He needed control. He needed to get ahead of this before it spiraled out of control. But deep down, he knew that it might already be too late. He glanced at the letter again, the words etched in his mind. "I'm coming for you." Richard clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let Daniel win. Not now, not ever. Richard walked into the large conference room, his face composed but his mind racing. Today was critical. The news of Daniel Marks buying shares in Hamilton Investments had shaken him, and now Daniel was present at this meeting, ready to face off with him again. Richard hated how personal this was getting. He had spent his career building an image of control, dominance, and now, someone from his past was slipping through the cracks. He took his seat at the head of the table. The board members were present, and the air was filled with a mixture of tension and confusion. Daniel was there too, sitting at the far end of the long conference table, his posture relaxed, an arrogant smile on his face. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room. "Thank you all for coming. We have some pressing issues to discuss. As you all know," his gaze landed on Daniel, who didn't flinch. Instead, Daniel smiled wider, as if challenging Richard to make a move. "We are here to discuss our next strategic steps in response to recent developments in the market," Richard continued, refusing to be rattled by Daniel's presence. He started the meeting, going over projections, financial outlooks, all the while ignoring Daniel's gaze. Midway through the presentation, Daniel stood up. Richard paused, his eyes narrowing. "If I may, Mr. Hamilton," Daniel said, his voice dripping with confidence. I have a proposal to make. I believe Hamilton Investments could benefit from a different perspective, one that considers the future, rather than clinging to outdated practices. The room went silent. Richard's eyes hardened. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Marks? He asked, his voice cold. Daniel walked to the front of the room, standing beside Richard. He was young, bold, and his presence seemed to fill the space. What I'm suggesting, Daniel said, turning to the board members, is a shift in leadership. Mr. Hamilton's methods have served their time, but times have changed. The market has changed. We need new leadership, new ideas. A murmur rippled through the room. Richard's face remained expressionless, but inside, he felt a flash of rage. This kid was standing in his company, in front of his board, suggesting he step aside. New leadership, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, the tension palpable. You think you can do better? Daniel turned to face him, his eyes cold. I don't just think so. I know so. Richard stood, his chair scraping back harshly against the floor. He looked at Daniel, their eyes locking. This is still my company, Marks, and you're out of line. Daniel didn't move, his gaze unwavering. For now, maybe, but I think everyone here knows that the future belongs to those who are willing to adapt. Richard clenched his fists at his sides. The board members were watching, some of them nodding subtly in agreement with Daniel. Richard's heart pounded. He had never felt so vulnerable in his own space. The room he had commanded for years now felt foreign. You talk a big game, Marks, Richard said, forcing a smile. But this isn't a game of words. You'll need more than a speech to take me down. Daniel stepped back, his smile fading. We'll see, Mr. Hamilton, we'll see. The meeting ended with a heavy silence. Richard returned to his office, his hands shaking slightly as he closed the door behind him. He had lost control of that room, and he knew it. He looked at the reflection in the window. He looked composed, but his eyes told a different story. They were filled with anger, fear, and something else he hated to admit, doubt. He sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to do something. He couldn't let Daniel take what he had built. He reached for the phone. Helen, he said, his voice tight. Get in touch with Marks. Tell him I want a private meeting. Offer him whatever it takes to get him to come here. Helen hesitated on the other end. Are you sure, Mr. Hamilton? Just do it, Richard snapped, and then hung up. He rubbed his temples, closing his eyes. He needed to end this, and fast. That evening, Daniel walked into Richard's office. He looked calm, unaffected, while Richard felt the tension deep in his bones. He gestured for Daniel to sit. Mr. Marks, Richard began, leaning back in his chair. Let's put the games aside. What is it you want? Money? Power? I can offer you both, but what I won't allow is for you to continue this vendetta. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. You think this is about money? Everything is about money, Richard retorted, narrowing his eyes. Not this, Daniel said, his tone serious. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. You want to know what I want, Richard? I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything. I want you to understand what you took from me. Richard's eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with dread. What are you talking about? Daniel's face darkened, his voice lowering. You abandoned your own son. You left him there, alone, with nothing. You didn't care what happened to him. You chose your reputation, your empire, over your own blood. Richard felt the color drain from his face. He stared at Daniel, the realization hitting him like a punch. Daniel's eyes burned with anger. Yes, Richard, it's me. I'm the boy you left on the side of the road. The boy you decided wasn't worth your time, your love, your money. Richard's chest tightened, his heart pounding. He couldn't breathe. That's not possible, he whispered. Daniel stood up, looking down at Richard with contempt. Believe it. I've spent my entire life waiting for this moment, and now that I'm here, I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what you did to me. He turned and walked out, leaving Richard sitting there, stunned. The door closed, and the silence that followed was deafening. Richard leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking. He had known, deep down, that this was coming. But hearing it, seeing the hatred in Daniel's eyes, it was almost too much to bear. The next day, the news broke. A story about Richard Hamilton, the powerful CEO who had abandoned his child. The headlines were brutal, the articles filled with contempt. Reporters gathered outside his building, cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Richard watched from his office window, his face pale. Helen walked in, her expression somber. "Mr. Hamilton, the shareholders are concerned. They're talking about pulling out. They think this is too damaging to recover from." Richard didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the crowd below, his mind reeling. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, it was all crumbling around him, and it was his own fault. He turned away from the window, his shoulders slumping. He had spent his entire life chasing power, money, and now it had all led to this. He had hurt the one person he should have protected, and now he was paying the price. Richard sat down at his desk, his eyes falling on the photo of his ex-wife and son. He picked it up, his hand trembling. He had made a choice all those years ago, and now he was living with the consequences. He knew there was no easy way out of this. He had to face it, face Daniel, and somehow try to make things right. He didn't know if Daniel would ever forgive him. He didn't know if he deserved it. But he knew one thing: he couldn't run from this anymore. He couldn't hide behind his money, his power. He had to face what he had done. Richard sat at his desk, staring at the papers scattered across it. The world outside his office had grown chaotic. Calls from shareholders, questions from the media, threats from board members. But his mind was somewhere else. It was focused on the past, on the young boy he had abandoned on the side of the road. It was focused on Daniel. He picked up the photo of his ex-wife and son again, his thumb tracing the outline of the boy's face. The child looked happy, oblivious to the harsh world he was about to be thrown into. Richard sighed, feeling the weight of everything he had done come crashing down. Helen knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. She looked concerned. Her usual professional demeanor softened. "Mr. Hamilton, are you okay? You haven't spoken to anyone since this morning." Richard glanced up, his face tired, lines deeper than they had been the day before. "No, Helen, I'm not okay. I need you to cancel all my meetings today. I need some time." Helen hesitated. "Are you sure, sir? The shareholders—" "I said cancel them," Richard snapped, then softened his tone, his eyes apologetic. "Please, Helen, just for today." She nodded slowly, backing out of the office. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed to understand, to piece together everything that had happened since he left his son. He couldn't comprehend how the child he left could have turned into Daniel, the man who now stood against him with so much hatred. The phone buzzed, and Richard ignored it. He couldn't think about the company, about the business. He had to think about his son, the one he had left behind all those years ago. His mind drifted to that day, the dusty roadside, his son's face as he stood there, tears streaming down his cheeks. Richard clenched his jaw, the image searing into his memory. That evening, Richard decided he couldn't hide from this any longer. He had spent years burying his past, covering it with money and success, but now it was out in the open. He needed to confront it. He needed to talk to Daniel, not as a rival, but as a father, or at least someone who had once been a father. He called Helen into his office. She looked at him curiously, noticing the change in his demeanor. "I need you to contact Daniel Marks. Tell him I want to meet, privately, just him and me," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with something different, something almost vulnerable. Helen hesitated. "Are you sure, Mr. Hamilton? After everything that's happened?" "Yes, I'm sure," Richard interrupted. He knew this was the only way forward. He couldn't let this continue without trying to make it right. The next day, Richard stood in an empty conference room, waiting. The air felt heavy, and the seconds ticked by slowly. The door opened, and Daniel walked in, his expression guarded, eyes hard. He didn't greet Richard, just walked to the other side of the table and sat down, his gaze never leaving Richard's face. Richard took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming, Daniel." Daniel folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "I didn't come here for pleasantries. If you have something to say, say it." Richard looked down at his hands, then back at Daniel. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I left you, and I can't change that, but I need you to understand—" "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice icy. "You don't get to explain it away. You don't get to justify what you did." Richard swallowed, nodding. "I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just trying to, I don't know, apologize. Maybe. I want you to understand that it wasn't easy for me, either." Daniel's eyes flared with anger. "Not easy for you." He stood up, slamming his hands on the table. "Do you know what it's like to be left like that? To wonder every day why your own father didn't want you? You think it wasn't easy for you." His voice broke slightly, the anger cracking to reveal the pain underneath. Richard flinched, but he didn't look away. "I made a mistake, Daniel. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you would be better off without me." Daniel shook his head, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Better off? I had nothing, Richard. Nothing. You chose your reputation, your money, over your own son." Richard felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring slightly. "You're right. I did, and I regret it every day. But I'm here now, trying to make it right." Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. There was silence for a long moment, the weight of the past hanging between them. "Make it right," Daniel finally said, his voice quieter, almost broken. "How do you think you can make it right?" Richard stood up, slowly moving around the table until he was standing in front of Daniel. He hesitated, then placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I don't know, but I want to try. I want to know you. I want to be in your life, if you'll let me." Daniel looked at Richard's hand, then up at his face. His eyes filled with a mix of emotion, anger, sadness, confusion. He stepped back, shrugging Richard's hand off. "It's not that simple." "I know," Richard said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I have to try. I have to do something. I can't change what I did, but maybe we can start over. Maybe we can—" Daniel shook his head. "You think this is about you? About making you feel better?" He laughed, a hollow sound. "This isn't about you, Richard. This is about what you did to me. And I don't think you can fix that." Richard felt his heart sink, but he nodded. "I understand, but I'll be here. If you ever want to talk, if you ever want to try, I'll be here." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked towards the door. He paused, looking back at Richard, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like sadness. "Maybe, someday, but not now." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Richard stood there, the room feeling emptier than ever. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this wasn't over. He knew that the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but at least he had taken the first step. At least, he had tried. Richard returned to his office, sitting down heavily in his chair. He looked at the photo of his son again, his eyes lingering on the boy's smiling face. He knew that the smile was long gone, replaced by anger and pain. He had caused that, and he had to live with it. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Richard answered, his voice tired. "Yes, Mr. Hamilton, the board wants to meet. They're concerned about the public fallout. They want to discuss your position in the company." Richard closed his eyes, nodding. "Schedule it for tomorrow." He hung up, his eyes drifting to the window. The city stretched out below, bustling, alive, unaware of the turmoil in his heart. He had spent his life building this empire, and now, in trying to reconnect with his son, he was risking losing it all. But maybe that was the price he had to pay. Maybe this was his punishment for the choices he had made. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. He didn't know what the future held, if Daniel would ever forgive him, if he could ever forgive himself. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to run from it anymore. He was going to face it, whatever it took. The boardroom was filled with tension. Richard sat at the end of the table, his face stoic as the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were here because of him, because of what had been made public. He could see the hesitation in their eyes, the lack of trust, the uncertainty. These men and women, who once looked at him with admiration and respect, now questioned his every decision. One of the board members, an older man named Gerald, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Richard, we need to address the current situation regarding the news articles. The shareholders are losing confidence. The company's reputation is at risk, and we need you to take action." Richard nodded. He knew this was coming, but the words still stung. "What action are you suggesting, Gerald?" His voice was calm, but there was a hint of exhaustion behind it. Gerald exchanged glances with the others before replying. "We think you should step back, at least temporarily. Let someone else take the public-facing role while we navigate this crisis." Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "You want me to step down?" Gerald hesitated, then nodded. "Just until we can stabilize things. The company needs a fresh face right now, someone who isn't associated with all of this." Richard looked around the table. The other board members avoided his gaze, staring at their notes or the table in front of them. He took a deep breath, trying to control the rising anger. "I built this company. Everything it is today is because of me. And now, Because of a mistake I made years ago, you're asking me to step aside. Another board member, a younger woman named Claire, spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Richard, it's not just a mistake. It's something that affects who you are as a leader, as a person. The public perception is critical. We need to think about the future of Hamilton Investment. Richard clenched his fists under the table, his eyes narrowing. He had worked his entire life to build this empire, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Fine, he said, his voice tight. I'll step back, but this isn't over. I'll do what I have to do for the company. But don't think for a second that I'm giving up. Gerald nodded, relief visible on his face. Thank you, Richard. We appreciate your understanding. Richard stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Meeting adjourned, he said, not waiting for their approval. He walked out of the boardroom, his steps quick, almost desperate. The moment the door closed behind him, he felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over him. Back in his office, Richard stared out the window, his hands in his pocket. The city spread out below, alive and thriving. He had been on top of it all for so long, and now suddenly, he was powerless. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the folder Helen had placed on his desk, documents on Daniel Marks. Richard knew he couldn't sit back and let everything fall apart. He had to do something. He reached for the phone, dialing Helen's extension. Get Daniel Marks on the phone. I want to meet with him again. This time, at my home. Helen hesitated. Mr. Hamilton, are you sure that's a good idea? Things have been tense. Just do it, Helen, Richard snapped, then sighed, softening his tone. Please, I need to talk to him. Later that evening, Daniel stood in the entryway of Richard's mansion. The atmosphere was tense, both men standing a few feet apart. Richard gestured for Daniel to follow him into the sitting room, and they sat down, facing each other across a glass coffee table. Daniel's expression was guarded, his eyes cold. What do you want, Richard? Haven't you done enough? Richard took a deep breath. I know I've done enough. Too much, actually. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you, what will it take for you to end this? The press, the shareholders, everything. What do you want from me? Daniel's lips twisted into a bitter smile. You think you can just buy your way out of this? You think you can offer me money, and I'll forget everything you did? Richard shook his head. It's not just money. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'm asking you to at least give me a chance. Daniel leaned back, his eyes narrowing. You really don't get it, do you? It's not about the money. It's not even about the company. I want you to admit what you did. I want you to stand in front of the world and tell them who you really are. A coward. A man who abandoned his own son because he was too scared to deal with his responsibility. Richard felt his chest tighten. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it out loud still hit him like a punch. You want me to confess? Publicly? Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving Richard's. Yes, I want you to tell the truth. And if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows anyway. I've already started. The press, the shareholders, they're just the beginning. Richard looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. He knew Daniel wasn't bluffing. The young man had already done so much damage, and he wasn't going to stop until Richard gave in. He took a deep breath, then looked back at Daniel. Fine, he said, his voice quiet. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected Richard to agree so easily. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. You think that'll make me forgive you? You think that'll make up for everything? Richard shook his head. No, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to try. I want to at least take responsibility for what I did. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then stood up. We'll see if you actually go through with it. If you don't, I'll destroy everything you have left. I promise you that. Richard nodded, his heart pounding. I understand. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Richard sat there for a long moment, the room feeling colder and emptier than it ever had before. He had always been in control, always been the one making the decision. But now, his fate was in someone else's hands, someone he had hurt more deeply than he could ever understand. The next day, Richard found himself sitting in front of a camera, the lights bright and hot on his face. The press had gathered, reporters murmuring among themselves as they waited for him to speak. He could feel his heart pounding, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. He looked down at his notes, then back up at the cameras. He could see the curiosity in the reporters' eyes, the hunger for a story. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "My name is Richard Hamilton," he began, his voice steady despite the fear he felt, "and I am here today to tell the truth, to admit to the mistakes I made, mistakes that have hurt the people I care about, and mistakes that I can never undo." He paused, his throat tightening. He could see Daniel in the crowd, standing at the back, his arms crossed. Richard looked directly at him, his voice softening. "Years ago, I abandoned my own son. I left him because I was afraid of how it would affect my life, my reputation. I made a choice that was selfish and cruel, and I have regretted it every day since." The room was silent, the reporters hanging on his every word. Richard swallowed, his eyes still on Daniel. "I know I can never make up for what I did. I know I can never take away the pain I caused, but I am here now, taking responsibility, and I hope, someday, my son can find it in his heart to forgive me." He finished, his voice cracking slightly. The room remained silent, and Richard could feel the weight of his words settling over him. He had done what Daniel asked. He had told the truth, laid himself bare in front of the world, and now all he could do was wait. He looked back at Daniel, hoping for some sign, some indication that this had made a difference. But Daniel's expression remained unreadable, his eyes cold. Richard turned away, the cameras clicking, the reporters shouting questions. He didn't answer. He just walked away, his heart heavy, the uncertainty of what came next hanging over him like a storm cloud. The moment Richard stepped off the podium, the noise became deafening. Reporters shouted questions at him, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. He kept his head down, his face pale but expressionless, pushing his way through the crowd. Helen was there, waiting by the exit, her expression filled with a mix of concern and sadness. "Mr. Hamilton, this way," she said, her voice steady. She led him through a back door and into a waiting car. The door closed, and Richard let out a shaky breath. He stared out the window as the car pulled away from the press, the noise fading behind him. Helen sat in the front seat, her eyes glancing back at Richard through the rearview mirror. "You did the right thing, Mr. Hamilton," she said softly. Richard didn't respond. He wasn't sure what the right thing was anymore. All he knew was that he felt empty, completely drained. The confession had taken everything out of him. The carefully built facade he had maintained for so many years had shattered in front of the entire world, and now all that was left was the truth. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. "Home," Richard said, his voice barely audible. The rest of the ride was silent. Richard leaned his head against the window, watching the city pass by. Everything felt surreal, as if he were moving through a dream. He closed his eyes, trying to gather his thoughts, but all he could think about was Daniel, his son, who had watched him confess his worst sins to the world. He wondered what Daniel thought of him now, if anything had changed. Back at the mansion, the silence was oppressive. The house felt colder than it ever had, the emptiness echoing in every corner. Richard moved through the hallways slowly, his footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. He passed by the grand piano, the polished keys untouched, and stopped in front of the old family portrait. He stared at it, his eyes lingering on his younger self, a man full of ambition, confidence, and arrogance. He had thought he could have it all, the power, the success, without any of the burdens. He had been wrong. He touched the glass, his fingers brushing over his ex-wife's face, then down to his son's. A knock echoed through the hall, startling him. He turned, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief moment, he thought, maybe, just maybe, it was Daniel. He moved quickly to the front door, opening it to find not Daniel, but one of his oldest colleagues, Harold, standing there. "Harold?" Richard's voice wavered, a mix of surprise and confusion. Harold nodded, his face grim. "Richard, we need to talk." Richard stepped aside, letting Harold in. They moved to the sitting room, and Harold took a seat, his expression serious. Richard sat across from him, feeling a sense of unease settle in. "Richard, I've been with this company since the beginning," Harold began, his tone almost gentle, "and I've supported you through everything, even when others doubted you. But things are different now." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew what was coming, but hearing it from Harold was like a knife to the chest. "The board is concerned," Harold continued. "They think it's best if you step down permanently, not just from the public-facing role, but entirely. The damage to the company is too great, and they believe it's the only way to save it." Richard felt his stomach drop. He had anticipated this, but that didn't make it any easier. "So, that's it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "They want me out." Harold looked at him with sympathy. "It's for the good of the company, Richard. You know that. You built something incredible. But sometimes, stepping aside is the only way to protect it." Richard clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "And who will take over?" "Daniel Marks." Harold hesitated, then nodded. "He's made a compelling case. The shareholders trust him. And, well, you saw today, he's relentless, and the public is rallying behind him." Richard stood, turning away from Harold, his hands gripping the back of the chair. "This is my legacy, Harold. Everything I've worked for, and you're just handing it over to him." Harold sighed. "Richard, this isn't about you anymore. It's about the company, the people who depend on it. We have to move forward." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He knew Harold was right. He had lost. He turned back to face Harold, his shoulders slumping. "Fine, I'll step down. But I want to meet with Daniel first, alone. He owes me that much." Harold nodded slowly. "I'll let him know. I'm sorry, Richard." Richard gave a small, bitter smile. "Yeah, so am I." That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at the empty fireplace. He had given up control of the company, the empire he had built from the ground up. He had admitted his worst sins to the world, and still, it wasn't enough. He had nothing left to offer, nothing left to fight for. He was just empty. A knock at the door broke the silence, and Richard turned, his heart skipping a beat. Helen stood in the doorway, her face filled with concern. "Mr. Hamilton," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Daniel is here. He agreed to meet with you." Richard stood, his heart pounding. He nodded, gesturing for Helen to bring him in. He tried to steady his breathing, tried to prepare himself for what was coming. He knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. It was the only thing he had left. Daniel walked in, his posture stiff, his eyes cold. He didn't sit, just stood there, staring at Richard. "You wanted to see me," Daniel said, his voice flat. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. "I wanted to say, thank you, for letting me do this, for letting me try to make things right." Daniel's expression didn't change. He remained silent, his eyes locked on Richard. "I know I can't undo what I did," Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I know that my apology doesn't erase anything, but I needed to say it, and I needed you to hear it." Daniel crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Do you think that makes a difference? Do you think that changes anything?" Richard shook his head. "No, I don't expect it to, but I needed to do it anyway." Daniel's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You did it for yourself, not for me. You think admitting it makes you noble? It doesn't. It just makes you desperate." Richard winced, the words cutting deep, but he nodded. "You're right. I am desperate. Desperate to try and be something, anything, better than what I've been." Daniel shook his head, stepping closer, his eyes burning with anger. "You abandoned me. You left me with nothing. You don't get to stand here now and act like you're some hero for admitting it." Richard felt tears prick at his eyes, his chest tight. "I'm not a hero, Daniel. I'm just a man who made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I'm trying, even if it's too late." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with pain. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I'll tell you this. I won't destroy everything. I've done what I needed to do. You've lost, and that's enough for me." Richard swallowed, nodding. "Thank you." Daniel turned, walking towards the door. He paused, looking back at Richard one last time. "This doesn't mean we're okay. It doesn't mean I forgive you. It just means I'm done with you." Richard nodded again, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand." Daniel left, the door closing behind him, and Richard sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. He had lost everything, his company, his pride, and any chance of a real relationship with his son. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time in his life. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if there was a future for him, or if this was it. But he knew one thing. He had faced the truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something better, however small that something might be. Richard's hands were trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. The morning was unusually quiet. The world outside continued to move at its usual frenetic pace, but for Richard it felt as though everything had slowed down to a crawl. He had been stripped of everything: his company, his pride, and the distance between him and his son had only grown wider. The confession had brought nothing but cold silence. Helen knocked gently on the study door before entering. "Mr. Hamilton, you have a visitor," she said, her voice low. Richard looked up, his eyes weary. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "It's Daniel, sir." Richard froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected to see Daniel again so soon, if ever. A part of him was afraid that Daniel was here to deliver the final blow. But another part of him, a quiet, hopeful part, wanted to believe that maybe there was more. "Send him in," Richard said, his voice barely steady. Helen nodded and stepped back, and moments later, Daniel walked into the room. His presence was commanding, and Richard could see the determination in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like hesitation. Richard gestured to the chair across from him. "Daniel," he said softly, "please, sit." Daniel didn't move for a moment, then slowly crossed the room and sat down, his expression guarded. He looked at Richard, his eyes scanning his father's face, searching for something. "What do you want, Richard?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but tense. "Why did you really want me here?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He looked down at his hands, then back at Daniel. "I don't know if there's anything I can say that will make a difference, but I need you to know that I meant what I said. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can never undo that, but I want to try, Daniel. I want to be a part of your life, even if just in a small way." Daniel stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just apologize and suddenly everything is fine?" Richard shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "No, I don't think it's simple. I know it's not, but I have to try. I have to at least put the effort in. I spent so long avoiding it, so long pretending that it didn't matter. But it does, Daniel. It matters more than anything." Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. There was a long silence, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. "You left me," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet, almost broken. "You made me feel like I wasn't worth anything, like I was just disposable." Richard felt his chest tighten, a deep sadness settling over him. I know, and I'm sorry. I can never make it right, but I want to at least try to be here now, if you'll let me." Daniel looked back at him, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. He stood up, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if I can just forgive you." Richard stood, his hands trembling as he reached out but hesitated, dropping them back to his sides. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm just asking for a chance to try, to do better. If you'll give it to me." Daniel stopped, his back to Richard. He was silent for a long time, and Richard could hear the tension in his breathing. Slowly, Daniel turned, his eyes meeting Richard's. "You're willing to do anything?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Richard nodded. "Anything." Daniel swallowed, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can ever see you as my father again, but maybe we can start with something small. I don't know what, but maybe we can try." Richard felt a surge of emotion, his heart pounding. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was something. It was a beginning. "I'd like that," Richard said, his voice trembling. "I'd like that very much." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. He walked towards the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. He looked back at Richard, his eyes still filled with pain but also with something else, a flicker of hope. "I'll call you," Daniel said, his voice soft, "but don't expect too much. This isn't easy for me." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I understand. I won't push. Just take your time." Daniel nodded once more and then opened the door, stepping out of the room. The door closed softly behind him, and Richard stood there, the silence settling over him. He took a deep breath, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't what he had hoped for, but it was something. It was more than he deserved, and for that, he was grateful. Later that night, Richard found himself sitting in the small library of his mansion. The grandiose decor felt out of place, like a shell of the man he used to be. He pulled a dusty book off the shelf and sat down, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. He opened the book but found he couldn't focus on the words. His mind was on Daniel, on the flicker of hope he had seen in his son's eyes. It was a fragile hope, one that Richard knew could be shattered easily. He had no illusions about how difficult it would be to build anything resembling a relationship with Daniel. The wounds were too deep, the past too painful. But he was willing to do the work, to do whatever it took to earn even a small part of Daniel's trust. Helen knocked on the door, peeking inside. "Mr. Hamilton, everything all right?" Richard looked up, a small, tired smile on his face. "I think so, Helen. I think things might just be all right." Helen smiled back, nodding. "I'm glad. If there's anything you need, just let me know." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Helen, for everything." She left, and Richard turned back to the book. Though he still couldn't focus on the words, he closed his eyes, leaning back in the chair. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm. The uncertainty was still there, but it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, moments when Daniel would pull away, moments when Richard would feel like giving up, but he couldn't, not this time. He had spent too long running, too long hiding from his responsibility. Now, it was time to face them, whatever it took. The next morning, Richard awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer had his company, no longer had the power and influence that once defined him, but he had something else, an opportunity, however small, to reconnect with his son. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't waste it. He stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The skyline was the same, but everything felt different. He wasn't the same man he had been a few months ago. He had lost so much, but in that loss, he had found something more valuable than he could have imagined. Richard picked up his phone, his hands steady as he dialed Helen. "Helen, it's me. I'd like you to clear my schedule for the week. I think it's time I took some time away from all of this." Helen's voice came through, warm and supportive. "Of course, Mr. Hamilton. Take all the time you need." Richard nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was ready to face it. He was ready to try, to build something new, no matter how difficult it might be. He put the phone down, his eyes drifting to the old family portrait on his desk. He picked it up, his fingers brushing over his son's smiling face. The road ahead would be uncertain, and the past could never be erased. But he would walk that road, step by step, until he could finally look Daniel in the eyes and know that he had done everything he could to make things right. The sun was just beginning to rise as Richard stepped into his kitchen, the golden light filtering through the wide windows. The quietness of the early morning felt different now, less oppressive, more peaceful. He moved slowly, brewing a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the room. It was a small comfort, but a welcome one. The world was different for him now, and he was trying to adapt. After losing the company, the sprawling mansion felt like a hollow monument to a past life, a symbol of everything he had prioritized over people. But he was taking steps to move on. He had begun the process of selling off parts of his estate, something he never thought he'd do. It was time to leave this place behind. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing on the counter. He glanced down at the screen. It was Helen. He picked up the phone, his voice steady, though his heart had quickened slightly. "Good morning, Helen." "Good morning, Mr. Hamilton." Helen's voice came through warmly. "I just wanted to let you know that the buyers for the smaller properties have confirmed the transactions. It looks like everything will go smoothly. You'll be able to finalize all the paperwork by the end of the week." Richard nodded to himself, a sense of relief settling in. "Thank you, Helen. That's good news." There was a brief pause before Helen spoke again, her voice softening. "How are you doing, Richard?" "Really?" Richard looked out the window, the city stretching out below, the skyscrapers glistening in the early morning sun. "I'm all right, Helen. Honestly, it's different, but I'm making it work." "That's good to hear," she said, a smile evident in her tone. "If there's anything else you need, you know I'm always here." "Thank you, Helen. I appreciate it," Richard said, a genuine warmth in his voice. He hung up and set the phone down. The reality of selling off his properties didn't sting the way he thought it would. It was part of the change, shedding his old self, bit by bit, making room for something different, something simpler. He knew he couldn't keep living in this empty mansion, surrounded by reminders of what he'd lost. He took his coffee out to the back terrace, looking over the carefully maintained garden. He remembered how his ex-wife had loved that garden, how she used to spend hours among the flowers, coaxing them into bloom. It was a memory that had once filled him with bitterness, but now there was something softer in it. a sense of what could have been if he had made different choices. That afternoon, Richard drove across the city to a small, modest apartment building. He parked his car in the lot, looking up at the building with a mix of trepidation and determination. He had decided it was time to downsize, to live somewhere that didn't come with the weight of the past. The real estate agent had mentioned a place here, an apartment that was quiet, simple, just what he needed. He walked into the lobby, where a young woman was waiting for him with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Hamilton?" she asked, her smile polite. "Yes, that's me," Richard replied. "Great, let me show you the unit we talked about," she said, leading him to the elevator. They rode up in silence, and soon she was unlocking the door to a small apartment on the 5th floor. Richard stepped inside, taking in the plain but bright living space. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like the mansion he was leaving behind, but it felt right. He moved through the rooms, his footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floor. The agent watched him, her smile widening slightly. "What do you think?" Richard nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I think it's exactly what I need." They moved through the paperwork quickly, and Richard found himself standing in his new living room, alone. He looked around, a deep breath escaping him. There was no grand furniture, no decorations or expensive artwork. It was empty, but it felt full of possibility. It felt like a place where he could start over. That evening, Richard sat on the floor of his new apartment, a small box of his belongings beside him. He hadn't brought much, just a few photographs, some books, and the essentials. He pulled out the old family photo, placing it on the windowsill. It was a reminder of why he was doing this, a reminder of what mattered now. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. It was a message from Daniel. "Got your message about moving. Hope it works out. Maybe I can come by sometime." Richard stared at the words, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope," he typed back, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'd like that, Daniel. Anytime you want." He set the phone down, a smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. A connection, however small. Daniel was reaching out, even if only tentatively, and Richard knew he had to be patient. He couldn't force anything. He just had to be there, ready whenever Daniel was. The following days were filled with quiet tasks, setting up the apartment, arranging his few belongings, trying to find a new routine. There were no grand meetings, no high-stakes deals to close. There was just the day-to-day work of living, of trying to make a home in this new space. Richard found himself spending a lot of time in the nearby park. It was a small green space, surrounded by the hum of the city. He liked to watch the people there, families with children, couples walking hand in hand, old friends sitting on benches chatting. It was a reminder of what he had missed out on, but also of what might still be possible, if he was willing to try. One afternoon, as he sat on a bench, sipping coffee from a small cafe nearby, he heard a familiar voice. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Richard?" It was Harold, his old colleague. Harold looked at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Harold," Richard said, standing up, a smile tugging at his lips. "What brings you here?" Harold gestured to the park. "My granddaughter loves it here. I bring her whenever I can." He looked at Richard, his eyes softening. "What about you?" Richard gestured to the bench. "I live nearby now, just getting used to things." Harold nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I heard about everything. I'm sorry, Richard. I know it must be hard." Richard shrugged, though his smile remained. "It is, but it's also necessary. I needed this. I needed to change." Harold looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. Maybe we could catch up sometime." Richard's smile widened. "I'd like that, Harold. I really would." They exchanged numbers, and Harold waved as he walked off, his granddaughter tugging at his hand. Richard watched them go, his heart feeling lighter. He was rebuilding, slowly, one small piece at a time. That evening, Richard sat in his small apartment, a simple meal in front of him. The phone buzzed again, and he picked it up, his heart skipping another beat when he saw Daniel's name. "Tomorrow evening, I'll come by." Richard smiled, typing back quickly. "I'll be here." He put the phone down, taking a deep breath. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be awkwardness, tension, maybe even anger. But the fact that Daniel was willing to come, willing to step into his new world, it meant everything. He looked around his apartment, the simple space that he now called home. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a beginning, a chance to build something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to do the hard work of becoming someone his son might one day be proud of. He picked up his fork, taking a bite of his meal. The flavors simple but comforting. He had lost so much, but sitting here in this small apartment, with the hope of seeing his son tomorrow, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was finally finding what truly mattered. The doorbell rang, and Richard felt his heart leap into his throat. He took a deep breath, wiping his hands on his jeans. He had spent the last hour tidying up his small apartment, making sure everything was in place, though there was little to organize. The space was sparse, the only decoration the few items he had brought from the mansion. A couple of books and the old family photos sitting on the windowsill. He crossed the small living room, his steps hesitant, his heart pounding harder with each one. He opened the door, and there stood Daniel, his expression guarded. He looked older than the last time Richard had seen him, or maybe it was just the way the evening shadows played across his face. "Hey," Richard said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey," Daniel replied, his eyes scanning the space behind Richard before he stepped inside. Richard moved aside, letting Daniel in. The younger man took a few steps into the apartment, looking around. It was a far cry from the mansion Daniel had once known, and Richard could see the curiosity in his eyes as he took in the simplicity of the place. I just moved in a few days ago," Richard said, closing the door gently behind them. "It's not much, but it works for me." Daniel nodded, his eyes lingering on the small bookshelf against the wall. "I wasn't expecting this," he said, his voice soft. "You really got rid of everything." Richard walked over to the counter, leaning against it. "I did. It didn't feel right, holding on to all that when I needed something different, something simpler." Daniel turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "It's strange, seeing you like this," he admitted. "I always pictured you in that big house, surrounded by everything you built." Richard gave a small, sad smile. "I thought that was what mattered. For a long time, I thought the company, the mansion, all the success, it was what made me who I was. But now, I see things differently." Daniel's eyes flicked to the family photo on the windowsill, and he walked over, picking it up. He stared at it for a long moment before looking back at Richard. "You know, I kept waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. When I was a kid, I kept waiting for you to come back, to find me. I always thought you'd change your mind." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of Daniel's words hitting him like a blow. "I wish I had," he said, his voice cracking. "I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do now is try to be here, in whatever way you'll let me." Daniel set the photo back down, turning to face his father. He crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "I don't know what this means, Richard. I don't know if I can ever see you as my father again, but I wanted to come here, to see for myself if you were serious, if you really meant what you said." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand, and I don't expect anything from you, Daniel. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Maybe we can try. I don't know what that looks like, but maybe we can try to figure it out." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'd like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'd really like that." Daniel gave a small nod, his eyes softening just a little. "All right, we'll see how it goes." Richard smiled, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. He gestured to the small table by the window. "Do you want to sit? I made some coffee, or I have some tea if you'd prefer." Daniel hesitated, then nodded, moving towards the table. They sat down across from each other, the air between them filled with an awkward kind of hope. Richard poured them each a cup of coffee, his hands only slightly trembling. They sat in silence for a while, both sipping their coffee, neither quite sure what to say. Richard didn't want to push, didn't want to say the wrong thing. He was just grateful that Daniel was there, that they were in the same room, sharing this small moment together. "So," Daniel said finally, setting his cup down, "what have you been doing with yourself? Besides moving in here, I mean." Richard shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not much, honestly, just trying to get used to everything. It's been different, but in a good way. I've been spending time in the park, Reading a bit, trying to figure out what comes next. Daniel nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. I never pictured you as the kind of guy who would sit in a park and read. Richard chuckled softly. No, neither did I. But here we are. I guess we're both surprising ourselves these days. Daniel's smile widened slightly, and he looked down at his coffee cup. Yeah, I guess so. Another silence fell between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. There was something lighter in it now, something that felt almost comfortable. Richard took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked at Daniel, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. I know this is just the beginning, and I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Daniel. I want you to know that. Daniel looked up, meeting his father's eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing, then finally nodded. I know, and I'm willing to try too. Richard felt tears prick at his eyes, and he quickly blinked them away, not wanting to break the fragile moment between them. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. That's all I could ever ask for. Daniel nodded again, his own smile small but real. They sat there, the quiet stretching between them, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of a broken relationship. It was the silence of something new, something that was just beginning to grow. After a while, Daniel stood, pushing his chair back. I should get going, he said, his voice soft. Richard stood as well, nodding. Of course, thank you for coming, Daniel. It means a lot. Daniel gave a small smile, then turned towards the door. He paused, looking back at Richard. I'll call you. Maybe we can grab lunch or something next week. Richard felt his heart swell with hope, and he nodded, his smile widening. I'd love that. Daniel nodded once more, then turned and walked out the door, closing it gently behind him. Richard stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, a sense of warmth spreading through him. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't everything he had lost, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile beginning that he was determined to nurture. He turned back to the room, his eyes falling on the family photo on the windowsill. He walked over, picking it up, his thumb brushing over the faces in the picture. He knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the mistakes he had made. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something new from here, something better. Richard set the photo back down, a smile playing on his lips. He moved to the window, looking out at the city, the lights twinkling in the twilight. There was a long road ahead, filled with challenges, with uncertainties, with moments of doubt, but there was also hope, and that was enough. He turned away from the window, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt ready to face whatever came next, ready to put in the work to rebuild his relationship with his son, ready to be the man he should have been all those years ago. He walked back to the table, picking up the empty coffee cups and taking them to the sink. The evening was quiet, the apartment still, but it felt full of possibility, full of hope, and for Richard, that was more than enough.